Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Ruth Kinna. Ruth is a professor of political philosophy at Loughborough University in the UK. She gained her doctorate in politics from the University of Oxford and, since 2007, has been the editor of the journal Anarchist Studies. She's published many academic papers and books for the general reader, including Anarchism, A Beginner's Guide, and The Government of No One, The Theory and Practice of Anarchism. Today, we discuss the intellectual tradition of anarchism in general, as well as particular strands that deal with spirituality and our relationship to nature. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Ruth Kinna. Ruth, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to be talking today about anarchism. Maybe we can begin with a bit of a kind of definition as to what anarchism is.
So, yeah, that's a tricky question. And there's no kind of settled definition, I suppose. I mean, the way I look at anarchism is to take it in a kind of more literal sense, I suppose. So the idea of no government. So just as monarchy means the government of one and oligarchy is the government of few, anarchy is the government of no one. And it points, I like that, I suppose, because it points to an idea that it's not about a single point of authority. It's not about a single leadership principle, but it allows for a concept of self-government within it.
Right.
And I think that's the essence of it.
Right. And often it's kind of cast out in terms of maybe dismantling hierarchies or unjust hierarchies.
Yeah. So if you reject the idea of a single permanent fixed authority, then you can have different kinds of, you can recognize that there are different inequalities, there are forms of domination, that there are hierarchies, but that what you're trying to do within anarchism is always to reveal and address those such that none of them can become entrenched. So the idea of anarchy is not that you're entering some kind of perfect realm of nothingness, or of a world in which there is no form of oppression or harm, but one where, because we're conscious of this and because we don't want to enslave ourselves to systems of power that become permanent sources of injustice and inequality, that we broaden the authority to everybody, and there's a kind of a sense of equilibrium or balance that operates within the social realm.
Right. And so, I mean, yeah, it's not just the case that there should be no centers of power at all. Like in the case of a parent holding a child back from playing in traffic, like they're exerting power, but that's a reasonable, right, exertion of power.
That's right. Although there's a very well-known anarchist from the 60s, an American anarchist called Paul Goodman, and he uses that precise example and says, of course, if a child is about to run in the street, then you hold the child back. But gentleness is always the answer to all questions of authority. So the emergency situation, of course, arises, but by and large, you're trying to avoid sort of sudden coercive force. Or sudden, sort of coercive instruction, if you like, because you have a kind of a different approach to cultivating behaviours and practices and introducing norms and that kind of educational sensibility, I guess.
Right. Yeah, and that makes me think. To me, that the idea of health I find quite useful. The idea of like a healthy society where people can organize themselves in a way where there are so many ways you can get things done, and you can make things operate in a positive way before you go to what should be the final, the last kind of resort of coercion and violence and stuff. And it seems that, the mainstream kind of society we live in now really just uses coercion and violence as the kind of the go-to first step. And so it seems that this tradition points to just the many, many ways people can organize by themselves. Right? We have this amazing self-organizing capacity. If you're, to use a trivial example, if you're ordering a pizza with a group of people, even if they're friends or people you don't know, people generally get by in, coming to some kind of consensus where everyone's broadly happy, right? We have this ability. You don't have to have an authority that tells you exactly what you're going to do. Exactly
right. And I think, from the point of view of political theory, the starting point for mainstream political theory is that anarchy is the realm of chaos and the realm of disorder. And therefore you must have some kind of constituted authority and generally a hierarchy that goes along with it in order to provide any kind of security in society. And the anarchist works from the other way around and says, actually, no, society pre-exists. If you look around the world, if you look around, we tend to adopt a very kind of Eurocentric view of what an ordered social realm is. And we tend to identify that with the state, which is a very modern way of organizing and a very European one, which has been exported, quite successfully to the rest of the world. But that actually, if you look at the way that people live in their environments, they will just self-organize. They will organize their own affairs. And if you give people the opportunity to express themselves and say how they want to organize, then they will do that as well. And we can see that in any kind of environment. I mean, it's possible to ask students, which is one of the things I try and do in my own teaching, what do they want to learn? Rather than say, this is what you're going to learn. You can give that latitude to people, and there's no real risk in it. And I think part of the problem of statism from the anarchist point of view is that it exaggerates the risk of disorder to the point where everything has to be regulated for fear that someone's going to do something wrong. And the anarchist says, no, we have to relax a bit, because societies are, that's how people live. They live in societies, they live in social groups, and they find their own orders and they find their own rules. And they're not perfect, but they learn and they develop under their own steam and by their own lights.
Right. And I mean, in that picture, right, freedom, I think, is a hugely important aspect, it seems, right, in anarchist traditions, that you're removing centers of control and organization and allowing people to kind of organize by themselves. And you mentioned fear, and as I have a kind of background in psychology and neuroscience, and to me it seems like the psychology of fear at a cultural level is one of the main things preventing us from moving in this direction. That there is all this what if, like if we let go of the kind of the vice-like grip of how society is organized, there are so many catastrophizing kind of ways you can think about things going wrong. And a simple example might be, well, if you take away the systems that organize my life, where's my food going to come from? And in a scenario where people have access to the land, I'm pretty sure that your first priority would be, okay, well, let's get together and start farming. Or, humans, you're not just all going to lie in bed and say, oh, well, there's no food, right? We have this natural ability to organize ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although because of the way that states have developed and economies, global economies have developed too, it's actually quite difficult now to think about those kinds of local provision. And one of the things that anarchists have long wanted to do, I mean, certainly since the late 19th century, is to encourage people to think about different kinds of social order and to descale and simplify their lives so that you can make these things possible. Because at the moment it's, and we can see that in our everyday lives now, what happens when there's no lorry drivers, there's no food on the shelves. And actually, there are different ways in which you can think about economies as being not something that exists separate to the way in which you live, but is essentially part of the way in which you live. We practice economics in our everyday living, just as we do in families, and you work from that basis on and think about what it is that people need and what they can provide for each other through their cooperation, rather than think in terms of what consumer societies encourage, which is to basically keep purchasing things that are generally, in terms of production, out of our reach.
Right. Yeah, I think that's economics can seem so distant and abstract, and the idea of actually that it really is just getting things done, at the end of the day, which, as you say, I mean, with society has been happening. It happens in animal, non-human animal communities as well. There you could even speak about economies there. I think it was David Graeber, the anarchist anthropologist, who I read a quote recently from him that said, what if we define the economy as how we take care of each other, which is a kind of another way of thinking about how we get things done. And that's very different to the way we currently think about it, which is this kind of growth-oriented, plunder the earth for resources to concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. It's suddenly, I'm always struck when I read in this area that, it sounds, all of these ideas of kind of challenging unjust hierarchy and domination and increasing freedom and living in this way seems so unobjectionable. I can't imagine someone who really took these ideas on board saying, well, no, I don't want that. I don't, because, by definition, if it's an unjust, hierarchy, then why wouldn't you want to challenge it? It's kind of funny to me that mainstream culture puts a lot of effort into kind of trying to squash any I guess perspectives that might challenge it. But anarchism seems to I don't see as much. I see it just being kind of dismissed as kind of almost utopian and just like, well, it's kind of wishful thinking, and we don't even need to engage with it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and anarchists themselves have recognised that. So one of the great 19th century writers, Peter Kropotkin, who had a similar idea to Graeber about economics. I mean, he contrasted what he thought mainstream economics was, which was a system of waste, to a principle of needs that was based on mutual aid and non-reciprocal exchanges. So, I mean, his idea, he recognised the fact that people, or at least some people, some liberals, could look at anarchist ideas and say, yeah, it's a beautiful idea, but it's never going to work. It's not practical. It's not feasible. And I suppose anarchists have been fighting a kind of a rearguard battle, partly because of the ways in which, certainly since the end of the 19th century, with the introduction of welfare, with 2 world wars, with growing sort of neoliberal capitalist economies, that everything just seems so out of our control, that to bring things back to people seems really, really difficult. But I mean, it seems to me that one of the conversations that's been kicked off, particularly by the climate crisis and the idea of global warming, is that we can't sustain that kind of living anymore. And unless we start to descale, and unless we start to think about what is more readily available in our local environments, and what can be genuinely sustained, rather than thinking about how we can sustain an unsustainable way of living, then we're never going to really address the problems that are in front of us. So it seems to me that anarchism is of its time. I mean, it's a shame it's taken 150 years for people to look at it seriously. But now is really the moment that I think anarchism comes into its own.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you made that connection to kind of ecological crisis, because 2 of my main kind of areas of interest is kind of are being fully part of nature, understood kind of biologically, and also meditation and a psychological approach to kind of being in the present in a way where you find fulfillment without the need to kind of, engage in goal-directed planning and consume and do all this other stuff. And all these things seem to come together to me in this perspective where we need to shift into this more kind of an economy that's aimed at meeting people's needs, but not in a way where you're just living at the poverty level, but where you're actually trying to find fulfillment through the things that are actually valuable in life. I'm really struck by the kind of atomization of humans socially in our kind of our current society. And I feel, we're so siloed in our nuclear families, and loneliness is this epidemic. And if instead we had fewer material objects, but community, and we could engage with nature and, have access to these things, to me, that seems like a far saner and more beautiful and enjoyable way to live. It's cliche at this point to say the best things in life are free, but it points to this profound truth. And it really is the perspective that probably the only way we could save the future of the planet is to live in this kind of way, I think.
That's right. And I think, another way of thinking about that is some of the work that's now being done, or some of the linkages that are now being made between anarchists and indigenous peoples groups. So actually, there's an awful lot that anarchists want to learn, or believe that can be learned, from entering into a dialogue with groups of people who have very different kinds of norms and practices to the ones that we're used to. And these are not, this is a sort of, it's often misunderstood as a sort of a primitive move. And it's nothing to do with that. It's nothing to do with thinking that there are modern people and non-modern people. It's simply to do with it's connected with just trying to find a different path in life, a different way of living, ways of living that actually exist. Even within Europe, even within highly advanced industrialized countries, you can go into the mountains in parts of Europe, and people live very different kinds of lives than they do in the cities. And it's tapping into those kinds of practices and values that I think anarchists want to rediscover, relearn, and see how we can adapt.
Right. And I guess it's almost by definition, I guess, before the emergence of civilization and states, every human society was a stateless society, and you could argue, I guess, was an anarchist society. Do you think that's a reasonable thing to claim?
So, yeah, well, sort of yes and no. I mean, so a lot of anarchists would say, I suppose, two things. One, that if you, certainly from the point of view of this sort of conceit in contemporary, in mainstream political theory, that you can't have order without the state, you can't have order without this sort of central points of authority. The upshot of that, or the upshot of that is that anarchy is actually the natural order. So society is anarchic, but it doesn't necessarily make it anarchist. So the anarchist wants to say, but societies can be cultivated in particular ways, and anarchy then becomes a political principle and an ethical principle, which encourages concepts of mutual aid, concepts of cooperation, concepts of consensus, of sharing, mutual support and care. And these are values that we can instill as a commitment, and practice as a commitment. So not all societies that are stateless are necessarily anarchist societies, but anarchy can still be considered to be the starting point, if you like, for everything that then becomes, or potentially could become, anarchist.
Right. And it might be worth hitting a few of the kind of the backgrounds of the European tradition, because I would love to tie this into the kind of indigenous traditions, but it might be worth because it seems so. I think when I think about anarchism, I tend to think in a very kind of almost as this kind of almost an eternal principle of like moving in the direction of decentralization and freedom. But I know you could also define it more narrowly as a specific historical political movement, right? That's European in its origins.
For a lot of the 19th century, I mean, so anarchism becomes a discernible trend, if you like, in political thinking around 1870, and it emerges from, if you like, as a kind of a left Republican tradition. So a tradition that's against tyranny, the tyranny of absolutism, that is seeking to find ways in which people can organize their own affairs as citizens. So it comes partly as a critique or a kind of a leftward push of those kinds of ideas, and partly as a rejection of Marxism, by which the anarchists meant really two things. One, they didn't like the way that, or they didn't like the threat as they saw it, that Marxism would introduce socialism through the state. So what Marxism promised to do was to do away with class oppression, but actually use the levers of the state in order to deliver that kind of socialist change. So the state retains its infrastructural existence. And the other thing they didn't like was a kind of an organizational principle, the idea that we should organize in political parties with programs of action, because this seemed too rigid to the anarchist. And so one of the things that anarchists wanted to do was to think about how you could organize collectively as socialists, if you like, anti-capitalists, but by redesigning the infrastructure, so to decentralize it and to federalize it. And the idea being that individuals themselves should never or should always enter into agreements under their own independent judgment, voluntarily. And that same principle worked for any kind of collective group as well. So you would federate on the basis of voluntary agreement, of genuinely free agreement, and no one would be there to arbitrate it or to enforce the agreements that you made with each other. So it's a sort of a long answer, but in in mapping out this kind of alternative to the state, anarchists also recognized that their own politics, articulated as anarchism in this European moment, if you like, was an expression of a much longer tradition of anti-authoritarianism. And so that what they said was that anarchism can take multiple forms, and there's no reason why it should take a European form. But it just so happens that it might work well in the European context to federalize like this. But in other parts of the world that were being colonized by the Europeans, there was absolutely no reason why you couldn't empower the local people, if you like, to continue with their traditional practices, because they were non-statist and they had every possibility of developing anarchistically, even if they weren't, as I say, sort of in the European frame, specifically anarchist in their politics. They were nevertheless self-organizing systems which would be free to federate with other anarchist systems as and when they wanted to do so. So I think there's always been that kind of strain within anarchism that's recognized that there are anti-authoritarian practices and self-organizing systems that don't conform to European models, and that there is a relationship between the two which has to be cultivated through mutual understanding.
Yeah, it really seems to me that something very special about anarchism is a commitment to a kind of radical diversity where, because as you're saying, this commitment to freedom and self-organizing, that you might start off by saying that anarchism is an ideology, but then it kind of, in an amazing way, it kind of removes its own ideological component in a sense where ideology is another form of control in some ways, that you could kind of intellectually try to say, this is how you should think, right? This is how you should organize. And so you can, once you realize the insight of, we should be moving towards freedom and decentralization and self-organization, then, as you say, it doesn't have to be the particular, well, this is the European tradition of anarcho-syndicalism, all the different subtypes, right? You say we have room for a true plurality of different approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in that sense, I think, it has one foot in European ideology in the sense that it comes out of a kind of post-French revolutionary moment and articulates itself against these other ideologies, against liberalism, against Marxist socialism, and or as an alternative, if you like, to these things and to republicanism. But at the same time, the nature of the critique that it presents to all of these European ideologies puts it outside of that framework, because anarchists are not looking to redefine the state or remold the state. They're looking to abandon it, and that puts them in a different frame of reference, I guess.
Right. I also read in one of your books, I think you're saying that you can understand anarchism as a kind of synthesis of liberalism and socialism, as these two great kind of European intellectual traditions coming together into one perspective.
Yeah, well, it's an idea that was floated by Rudolf Rocker, who was early 20th century organizer and intellectual, sometimes known as the anarchist rabbi, because he although he came from, he was a native German speaker, he was brought up in Germany, but he did a lot of his active work before the First World War in the East End of London, and particularly with Jewish workers, and he learnt Yiddish in order to do so. And he has this idea makes this statement that anarchism emerges from these two traditions. But I think he also makes clear in what he subsequently says is that the way in which it brings these traditions together also makes it, because it's anti-statist, a clearly oppositional current. It can't be reconciled with them, with traditional socialism, with traditional liberalism, but it would take from liberalism, if you like, the principle of sanctity of the individual. He says at one point, the individual is the measure of all things. So, this idea of exercising your independent judgment, but also in a way that enhances collective well-being, which is something that it takes from socialism. So it takes these principles, but understands that these principles can only operate where you don't have centralized authority.
Right. And it's, I mean, when you look at individual kind of thinkers, sometimes, there can be this kind of siloing into different traditions where you say, well, these are the individualist anarchists and these are the kind of collectivists. But as someone, when you look at the work as a whole, the power of the tradition seems to me that it holds both of these perspectives, right? It doesn't have to be either or. And I think of it in terms of kind of any networked system. It makes sense to both consider the individual nodes, but also the whole structure. And I think that's true of us as individuals in a society. If you're fully individualistic and you ignore the fact that an individual can only exist in a collective framework, that's kind of, blinkered in one way. And if you want to negate the individual fully in favor of the collective, then you're losing sight of the fact that it's always the individual who suffers, has the experience of suffering. So that seems really powerful to me. It's also mirrored in something I talk a lot about here, which is that in these kind of in many spiritual traditions, you have this perspective of you could say kind of being one with the universe and everything being equivalent and in this absolute perspective. But then there is also a kind of a relative separation between us all, and they're both true. You get this kind of paradoxical stance. I think anarchism shares that as well. I think I see this connection of, it's a deep insight into the nature of any networked system and the kind of the strange situation we're in, the paradoxes of being an individual in a collective context. Do you think that's a big aspect of anarchism, that it can embrace both of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's, for me, it tends to be a question of emphasis rather than a fault line, which is how the individualist communist distinction is sometimes made. I mean, one of the people, to go back to Kropotkin, who's, regarded as, one of the great contributors to anarchist thinking, and someone who is a communist in terms of his ideas about property, who basically says, you have to have distribution according to need, and you have to have systems which enable mutual support. But he also says, the essence of anarchy is the idea of individual sovereignty. Individuals are the basis of all moral worth. But individuals, we're not. He says, not even Robinson Crusoe lived alone. He's brought up in this communal atmosphere. He's a social being. We are social beings. We don't live in isolation, and therefore we have to navigate and negotiate our sovereignty as social beings. And that's a creative tension, because it's only when we realize the tensions that exist between us that we can resolve our differences, and then we change our practices and we change our norms. So you're not relying on the law to make a decision for you. You're relying on each other to constructively and creatively address your differences in order to live a good social life.
Right. Yeah, and it seems a power that of anarchism, that it can, as you say, it can kind of emphasize either of these sides depending on the context. If you're living in a situation where it's overly individualistic, you could emphasize the collectivist and vice versa. And another way in which the tradition seems to hold many different perspectives is you could look and say, well, there are countless number of subtypes of anarchism, of people identifying loads of different kind of adjectives. And then there's also this anarchism without adjectives. Is that the tradition that kind of resonates with me? Because I find the appeal being this. I guess anarchism being a broad umbrella concept where people with different perspectives can all kind of come together. That seems to resonate with me. Perhaps, could you explain that to the audience?
So I mean, in a sense, anarchism without adjectives, it emerges as a current or as a position in the 1880s or so, and it comes initially from Spain, and it was partly, or I suppose it was inspired by the idea that if we were going to think about transformational change, and as anarchists, you could only think about transformational change from the bottom up. So it's, only people can change their lives. You can't do it for them. You can give them ideas, you can give them help, you can give them support, you can express solidarity, but you can't do it for them. That you can't legislate for change. So if people themselves were going to be the agents of their own transformation, then it seemed to Spanish comrades that it was wrong in principle to prescribe the ways in which they should organize after the revolution, or as part of this transformation. You couldn't prescribe that, you know, all property would go into, would cease to exist. You couldn't say that, you know, people would have to find their own rules and their own practices. And in fact, what happened in Spain, certainly in parts of the collectivist or the collectivized areas, the anarchist areas in the Spanish Revolution and the Civil War, was that they did precisely this, that villages reconstitutionalized themselves according to local preferences. And in some cases, they would undertake land surveys and decide what was going to be collectively owned and what people could individually own. So anarchism without adjectives was the idea that we weren't going to call ourselves communists or collectivists or individualists or anything else. We were just going to encourage people to become anarchistic in their practice. But I mean, the only thing I'd say, sort of in defense, if you like, of those who did apply the adjectives, is that it comes back to this question of practicality and feasibility, and how you communicate, you know, what the beautiful idea might look like, if it's going to be more than a utopia. And I think anarchists are between a rock and a hard place, because in order to convince the skeptics, they do need to say something about how they would reimagine social order, and so communism and collectivism and individualism, if you like, and eco-anarchism and all these other things, anarcho-feminism, they're all attempts to articulate what that better alternative might look like. But I don't think, I mean, there are not that many anarchists who in engaging in that practice are actually insisting that this is the only way. What they're trying to do is to empower the imagination, I guess. But you know, I think in doing that, you have to bear in mind that the without adjectives is a really important background principle, if you will, because there can be no final answers. It can only be the groups of people themselves who determine their own futures.
Right. And you mentioned kind of eco-anarchism. It makes sense that, you know, if you go back to the kind of 60s, at that point, it probably really made sense to say I'm an eco-anarchist or a green anarchist, or, you know, to point to the fact that in this particular context, awareness needed to be raised around the kind of the way we were damaging nature. I almost take it for granted now that if anyone who's an anarchist, I would assume, has some kind of ecological awareness, given the kind of impending nature of climate change. That's, I guess I see it as emerging it again in the right context. That's when you might emphasize, well, I'm emphasizing this or something else. And in the 60s, you had you had Murray Bookchin, right, who seemed to be a real kind of leader in raising awareness around the ecological crisis, and also, so his perspective was social ecology. Was that what he proposed?
Yeah, correct. And Murray Bookchin was I suppose the person who really pushed a kind of the green shift within anarchism. And although, I mean, his work is quite controversial for some anarchists, I mean, he was the person who looked very closely at the ways in which cities, in particular in America, had developed in these, you know, deeply alienating, deeply unjust, and repressive kind of ways, and recommended that, he put. And he was quite critical, I suppose, of some of the earlier anarchists, although I think there was always a kind of an ecological sensibility, even if it wasn't represented in those or presented in those terms. But he put nature at the heart of an anarchist planning, if you like. So his whole philosophy is based around the idea of human beings being part of nature, It's an idea that certainly within the thinking of people like Kropotkin and the theory of mutual aid, we are animals. We're just animals of a particular sort. But Bookchin really made this a sort of the linchpin of his anarchism, and his organizational ideas sprang from it. And so, social ecology was the mainstay, I suppose, of green anarchism in the 60s and 70s, and from there it's taken different kinds of wings.
Yeah, I mean, to bring it back to, we were talking before about how you could synthesize anarchism with kind of indigenous traditions. When I've read Bookchin, I've got the impression that he seems to be in a kind of European rationalist tradition that does believe in some kind of progress, and I get the impression that he thinks, I mean, that's the kind of logic that led to kind of colonialism, and I don't think he would advocate that, but it seems to have that kind of flavor of where, civilization is moving in the right direction, and the past was kind of primitive, and we don't want to be returning there. And I guess the counter kind of green ecological perspective in anarchism would be anarcho-primitivism, right, where the perspective is that civilization itself is kind of a pathology.
Yeah, that's right, and which was sort of one of the major sort of lines of debate, I suppose, in the late 70s and early 80s between Bookchin and some of his critics. I mean, I think, I'm not sure that Bookchin was as much of a sort of civilizationalist as some of his critics suggested, but there was certainly, there's a role for reason in Bookchin's ideas that for any kind of post-structuralist or well, not just post-structuralist, it becomes problematic. It looks very Enlightenment. It looks, that's certainly part of Bookchin's thinking. I mean, I think one of the people who I tend to turn to is a sort of 19th, early 20th century thinker, Gustav Landauer, who actually I think had a really fantastic grasp of community, as someone who also felt that individuals humans were part of nature, and who could have the potential. I mean, he had an idea of progress that was very un-Enlightenment, in the sense that he felt that our betterment depended on our establishment of communal ties, and the only thing that stopped us from doing that was understanding each other properly, and domination was the problem that particularly Europeans had to tackle, because that it made them deaf to everybody else. It made them sort of, they just couldn't see alternative practice, or they could only see alternative practice as being somehow barbarian or primitive or crude or vulgar and not civilized. And his idea was that itself was a construct that we had to overcome, and that in establishing community and establishing or re-establishing our relationship with the earth, one of the things we had to do was question our own assumptions and principles, such that we could bring ourselves in community with people that we thought were strangers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to the primitivist critique of civilization, I would say, where it seems like agriculture sets us down it puts in place the mechanisms by which you can hoard wealth and you can have control and domination. But I would probably limit it to say that I think it's a useful critique, but not necessarily that the solution is to rewind the clock back to some arbitrary, point in time that you can't really define. If the problem is technology and tool making, we had hominids were making fire before we were even Homo sapiens, right? So do you try and roll back to to that point? And but I think it's a really it's a really powerful way to understand our circumstance, because part of the logic of civilization, I think, is that it tells us that we're on the right track, that this is progress, this is entirely positive. But those are the narratives that are being told to us by the people who benefit most from civilization, who get to hoard the wealth. And so I think that, I feel like for many people, this idea, entertaining the idea that the past 10,000 years, the trajectory we've been on, may not be the best thing in the world, and actually may be something that's worth thinking twice about, in the very least. I don't see that discussed at all in the kind of mainstream. I think that could be a big ask for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, I think it was a sort of a mainstream view within anarchism that civilization was a construct which concealed a supremacist mindset, and that civilization was misleading at best and utterly destructive at worst. And so, the kind of the concept, or the idea of European progression, the idea of enlightenment and perfectibility, all of those things I think anarchists threw out. But I think there's a difference between some of the earlier thinkings about, well, what do you do then as a response to civilization, and primitivist ideas. I think there's a difference there, and I think while there's a correspondence or a shared set of views, if you like, about the unhealthiness, the destructiveness of civilization, the way it diminishes people, disempowers people, makes them unhealthy, detaches them from communities and social life and all the rest of it. I think, for the critique of technology doesn't necessarily run alongside it in the same way in the 19th century as it does in the primitivist, the 20th century primitivist critique. So I think and it's a moot point, I think, how far you can take any kind of technology and clean it up. But I think that's partly what the 19th century project was about. How can you aid, how can you empower people to use technologies that will take them out of subsistence, that will enable them to feed themselves well? How can you do that? Is a greenhouse a destructive technology?
Right. Yeah. I think it brings me back to, I tend to think about these things psychologically, and I think hand in hand with that kind of wise use of technology as tools would have to go hand in hand with this kind of reducing the collective kind of fear, the collective trauma that's held in the population, that leads us to, I feel like the trajectory of civilization was, we had fear of being kind of the trauma of death in nature, and then not being in control of nature. And so there's this instinct to control it that kind of, is reasonable at first, but then you get into this kind of this frantic momentum of more and more domination and control of not only nature, but of other people. And there's this psychological process that goes along with the use of the technology in this unreflective, unconscious way. And if you have those two things hand in hand, where you're developing sustainable technologies that exist within an economy that's designed to meet people's needs rather than for relentless growth and concentration of power, combined with people being more present, being more grounded, and feeling okay with existence, instead of unconsciously being driven into kind of needing to soothe themselves. I see kind of consumerism is almost like an addiction of distraction, because we're unsettled as a population, I think. No, I was just reminded when you were talking, there's a I don't know if you know the book Freddie Perlman's Against History, Against Leviathan, or Against History. But there's it's a fantastic book, and it's a very sort of poetic piece of writing. But there's one point where he talks about, I think he describes Moses as the first Leninist, and then quotes the piece from the Bible where Moses is told by God that everything on the earth belongs to human being, or to man, and you should make use of the fowl in the sky and the fish in the sea, and it's all yours to exploit. And he uses this to as a kind of a touchstone, if you like, for the way in which statism or Leviathan kind of develops as this machine that's designed to sort of fuel people's desire for control. That's the principle, the economic principle, if you like, that has to be undone. And I think, as you say, that there are ways that we can approach that, different ways that we can approach that, perhaps. But I agree. What's called the primitivist movement certainly put that on the table as a really important kind of statement, if you like. Right. I think the concept of Leviathan, of this kind of, society being like this huge unconscious organism that we're embedded in, that's kind of governing our lives, is, to me, it's trying to kind of grapple with that and understand it is one of the most, I guess, important but also hard things to do, to really understand how this strange machine got going of civilization and the implications of it.
Yeah.
On the indigenous kind of anti-colonial movement point we spoke about earlier, it seems like the term primitivism seems kind of inaccurate, right? It suggests a kind of linear time where we went from kind of hunter-gatherers into civilization. And actually, I think it was David Graeber again. I saw a lecture a while ago where he made the point that in North America, by the time the Europeans arrived, there had been the kind of this Mississippi mound civilization. There was agriculture, there was centralized civilization, but it had collapsed around that time. And when the Europeans arrived, they find people living in what you might call kind of anarchist, groups of people self-organizing, and they had trouble. If they said, "Take me to your chief," and there often wasn't a conception of a chief, of like a leader, And he was making the point that it's not that they found a primitive peoples. They found a people who, you could argue, had tried civilization and decided, okay, we actually want to consciously organize ourselves in this more sustainable, wise way. And so there's kind of a far more advanced way of being than the mindset that the Europeans were in.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, and I think you get the same, that thought, if you like, underpins the anti-colonial critique. So, one of the lines of argument, particularly that was raised by American anarchists about Mexico, was precisely this: that what you're doing is not just you're not just extending the reach of capital in Mexico, but you're destroying people's ways of life, which they have practiced for centuries and which work for them, and which have, from the point of view of someone sitting in North America, have enormous appeal and virtue. And what you're doing is that you're imposing upon people social relationships that are simply alien to them. And I think that's I think that's also the lesson of Landau, who says, there are no peoples of origin. We're all peoples of origin. It's just how far we can understand other people's practices. That's the thing that makes the difference. And we can't judge people by our own standards of civilized life. And the problem of the European state project is that it does precisely that.
Right.
And then imposes it upon them. It forces it upon them with great violence. That's how it succeeds.
And there also, in the kind of indigenous perspectives, there's often a kind of what you might call kind of ecological spirituality, in contrast to the kind of Judeo-Christian separation, domination of nature. And I'm interested in this kind of spiritual tradition in anarchism as well, because there's this anarchist slogan, "No gods, no masters," right? It's but then there's also this kind of Christian anarchism with kind of Tolstoy and then Taoism as well. It seems it's far more ancient kind of Eastern religion that emphasizes decentralization and this kind of living in harmony with nature. Is that still a kind of a kind of, I guess, a living component of anarchism? Yeah,
I think so. I hope so. And I think that there's again, a bit like we were saying earlier about the division between so-called individualists and communists. I think the distinction between anti-clerical and religious anarchists can be overplayed. So the "No gods, no masters" is a great slogan, and it directs attention not just to the church, but to the idea of political theology, if you like, the idea that human beings somehow are corrupted, imperfect beings, expelled from Eden, fallen, and therefore require discipline to make them good. And that's the basis of the anarchist principle. It doesn't mean to say that you throw out any kind of spirituality or belief, And I think when you look at people like Tolstoy, I don't think Tolstoy would have a problem with Bakunin's political theology. He's someone who quite consciously sets himself against the orthodoxy of the church, but is someone who thinks that there is a greater truth, if you like, than the kinds of than the common sense that we have embodied in our social and political life, and that sense of truth is something that individuals can realize through religion, but it's not a program of belief. It doesn't have a doctrine as such, and I think that's a very powerful aspect of anarchist thinking. That there may be something that we can't articulate in our social relationships with each other, and maybe something that we have to think differently about.
Right. And also, I mean, out of Thoreau in particular, there's this tradition of kind of anarcho-pacifism of when we think about the kind of diversity of tactics people might use to move towards a more anarchist world. I'm very interested in this kind of anarcho-pacifist stance of saying you can't, if you're against domination, you can't use kind of, I guess, power and you can't try and dominate others and intimidate them into your agreeing with you. What you might do is educate and try to, if you think this is truly a good way to live, you should be able to convince others, hopefully. And, from this perspective, I sometimes think, one of the positive things about anarchism, as far as I can see, is that you can't really have an anarchist world without anarchists, without people wanting to live in this way. You can't impose it on people who don't want to live in this way. So I mean, I guess anarchism also encompasses a diversity of tactics, right? But is this a significant one? This kind of education.
Yeah, so you're right. You can't have anarchism. You can't have anarchy without anarchists, but you don't have to have anarchism for anarchy. So so you don't have to subscribe. It comes back to what we were saying about ideology. Anarchists don't want to turn people into believers. They want people to organize their affairs and basically they make a series of recommendations about environmental and structural change that they think will enable people to do this in ways that are creative and consensual and in principle anarchist. But you don't have to practice as anarchist in order to live in anarchy. I lost my train of thought now, but there was something you said about diversity of tactics. So I read Thoreau slightly differently. I mean, one of the things that, and I think Tolstoy is a similar kind of case, that both of them are talking about ideal practices and behaviors, and in an ideal world we don't batter each other over the head in order to secure compliance. We talk to each other, we reason, we persuade, we implore. That's what we do because we respect everybody else as being, sovereign individuals. But I think that's a different, within that, both Thoreau and Tolstoy allow that, struggle doesn't work like that. Thoreau writes the essay about John Brown, who goes out and kills slavers and celebrates his action, not because he thinks that we should be going out and killing people we disagree with, but because he understands, as I think Tolstoy does too. I mean, Tolstoy writes as much about war as just about anything else, but because he understands that people come to their faith, their religion, their truth, they find their way in a manner that's really complex and conflicted and challenging, and involves them in making moral choices which no one else can prescribe for them. And that's how I would understand it, rather than say you have to do this or you have to do that. I mean, for me, if the same kind of logic applies to resistance as it does to anarchy without adjectives. There can't be one rule.
Right.
There have to be decisions.
And maybe to end on, something as well I really love about anarchism is so one can have these kind of experiences of the sense of linear time going away, and the feeling of life being kind of, the idea of the journey is the destination, that it's a kind of eternalism, feeling of being in the present and feeling very at home. And I get a similar feeling when I think about the kind of political project of anarchism, because if you're a Marxist-Leninist and your vanguard party hasn't seized control of the state, well, then you're in a state of kind of either hoping it will happen one day or feeling frustrated that it's not happening. And that's your situation. Whereas you can, at least, some traditions of anarchism emphasize this idea of it being a kind of an ongoing, never-ending process, and not in a kind of Sisyphean way where you're never going to get anywhere and it's all kind of exhausting. But instead, it makes me feel like when you realize that even in the best society ever, you should still be trying to keep an eye on, make sure there's not going to be, people trying to dominate and this stuff isn't going to get out of control again. And so that makes me feel like, unlike the person who's like, well, my ideal political world is all the way over there and I'm never going to get there, even though I'm not content by any means with our current civilization, it makes me feel like I'm a sense of home, of being like, okay, well, we're here and we can actually be anarchists today. Like right now, you can engage in mutual aid and try and support people and help people become more free and become more free yourself. And we're at the destination. Does that make sense? Yeah,
well, so I think that's right. So, the idea of as if, you can live as if you're in anarchy. Right. And of course, in doing that, you're always going to come across obstacles and constraints and all sorts of things. So, I guess the idea is that, collectively you try and chip away at these things. But I think, I'm not sure that that's entirely presentist. I mean, so you can only live in the present, but again, I mean, it's something that Landauer says, that we make our future by changing the way we act in the present, but we do that on the basis of rethinking our past. And we don't necessarily have to excavate different histories to understand that the official story is not the only story, to know that we can critique what we're presented with. These are also tools, and history is a really important tool. So the kind of work that, I mean, you talked about Graeber earlier, knowing that kind of, or having access to that kind of alternative account of the settlement of America, that's empowering, because it helps us rethink our present and therefore change our future. So it's a relationship between all of those things, I think.
Yeah, well, hopefully we've empowered some people with the conversation today. Thanks so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it too.
Yeah. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
There's a profile page on the Loughborough University site, and there's all sorts of information about me there. I've got a ResearchGate page where you can access some written work, and then there's a Loughborough University research repository, and if you just put my name in, then all of the work that's open access will come up.
Great, and I highly recommend your books as well. They've been a really amazing introduction to this for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you again.
Pleasure.